Shalom and welcome to the first video in our new four-part series, Hosea, A Love That Would Not Let Me Go. While this is actually a part of our installment of the Kings and Prophets, don't really worry if you haven't watched any of the other videos in the series, because the study of Hosea really could stand all by itself. But if you'd like to watch the other videos in this installment of Kings and Prophets, the very first video series is called Divided Heart, Divided Nation, and can be found on my YouTube channel. So be sure to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel for notifications of when all the new videos are going to be posted. And while you're there, check out some of the other videos that are available. There are actually over 100 of them. If you'd like to join us for a live study, you can contact me through Facebook Messenger, and I'll be more than happy to send you the link and the password for our free Zoom classes held every Thursday from 6:30 to 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. So before we begin to actually unpack these first three chapters of Hosea, let's get some historical and cultural context. First of all, Hosea prophesied actually to the northern kingdom of Israel during the times of Jeroboam II, who was king of the northern kingdom, and Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, who actually were kings of the southern kingdom of Judah. So when you look, Hosea prophesied between 755 and 714 BC. Now during this time, while Hosea was prophesying in the northern kingdom, Isaiah and Micah were prophesying in the southern kingdom. Now, these chapters that we're going to unpack tonight, chapters 1 through 3, were all prophesied before Assyria invaded Israel in 732 BC. Now, Hosea follows kind of this prophetic pattern. First, God deals with the nation's sin. Then God deals with the consequence of that sin. Then God deals with the nation's future. Now, we get a really good glimpse of this in the first three chapters. So if you'd like, you could actually stop this video and go through the first three chapters and write down each part of that pattern with the verses that they coincide with. God dealing with the nation's sin, God dealing with the consequences of that sin, and how God deals with that nation's future. Now, in the book of Hosea, just in the first three chapters, God actually speaks to Hosea either 5 or 6 different times, depending on whether you think there's one message or there's 2 messages in chapter 2. Now, in chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, that's when he first spoke. Now, by the time we get to verses 4 and 5, that's the second time he spoke, but that's at least 9 months after the first time. 9 months later, he spoke in verses 6 and 7. And then at least another 9 months later, and it might have even been more than that, he spoke chapter 1, verse 8 through chapter 2, verse 1. Now, then he spoke in chapter 2, verse 2 through verse 23, and that was before the Assyrian exile. Now, you may decide that chapter 1, verse 8, clear through till chapter 2 through 23 is just one message, and that's okay, in which case he spoke 5 instead of 6 times to Hosea. Now, the last time he spoke in these first 3 chapters is chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. And we really don't have a way to determine any kind of time frame of when he spoke this. There are also 31 I will statements made by God in the first 3 chapters of Hosea alone. Now, you always want to mark when God says I will, because you learn so much about God that way. So let's start with chapter 1, the first 3 verses. In this first message to Hosea, God told him to take a wife of harlotry. Basically, go out and find yourself an adulterous wife, and then have children of harlotry. Now, what we don't know is this. We don't know if that children of harlotry means that Hosea may not have been the father of his adulterous wife's children. They may have actually been children from men in her affairs, but because they were married, then Hosea was seen as their legal father. That's how I interpret children of harlotry. You may interpret it a different way. Now, that harlot is a zanun, and that either means prostitution, but it could also, in a broader picture, mean idolatry. Now, why? Why would God go tell his prophet to go marry an adulterous wife and then have children through her adultery? Because the people of the land, of the northern kingdom of Israel, his people, had committed such flagrant harlotry and forsaken God. Now, forsaken really isn't in the original text, and what it really means is they've committed flagrant harlotry from not following after God. Now, Hosea is what I like to call a pictorial prophet, meaning his actions gave the people of his times these signs or pictures of what God thought about them and how he was going to deal with them in their very near and also their distant future. Now, we actually studied, and you can find the study in my YouTube channel, about a very famous pictorial prophet. I think the most famous pictorial prophet in Scripture, and that is the study of Ezekiel, the silent prophet. But in doing my studies, I found two other prophets who were also told to give this picture to the people. Now, very interestingly enough, in Isaiah chapter 20, verses 1 through 4, God told Isaiah to walk around barefoot and naked for 3 years, as a sign not to the southern kingdom where he was actually prophesying, but to Egypt and Cush. And the sign was that Assyria was going to carry away Egypt and Cush, and that they would be naked and that their hind ends would be showing when they left. Now, in Jeremiah 13, 1 through 11, Jeremiah is also given a pictorial prophecy, but his isn't as dramatic as either Ezekiel or Isaiah. Now, what God told Jeremiah to do was to put on a linen waistband, and then he told him to take it off and to go and hide it. Now, Jeremiah buried it in the dirt near the Euphrates River. And after a while, God told him to go back and dig it up. Well, of course, when he dug it up, it was ruined. It was totally worthless. It was white when he started, and it had been buried by the water. It was disgusting. So God's picture in all that was to say that his people should have clung to him, just like that waistband. They should have clung to him, but they didn't. And just like the waistband had become worthless, so were his people who had flat out refused to listen and to obey. So let's jump back to Hosea chapter 1 and look at verses 4 and 5. Now, Hosea, his first child of harlotry, because of his wife's adultery, was named Jezreel, which means God sows, S-O-W-S, like a farmer. God sows. But the context of that name was not a blessing. It's not like he was going to sow and they were going to reap this amazing harvest. It was actually in the context of severe judgment. Because he said God would punish the house of Jehu for the bloodshed of Jezreel. Literally speaking, the bloodshed on Jezreel. He was going to put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. And he was going to break the bow of Israel in the Valley of Jezreel. And to break the bow means he's going to break their strength and their power and the military might. Now in 2 Kings verses 9 and 10, we studied that God used Jehu to wipe completely out Ahab's house and eradicate Baal worship from Israel. And because of that, God allowed Jehu 4 generations of kings of his family to be kings of the northern kingdom. That was the most generations that any king had ever had. Now, most of these events of Jehu eradicating Ahab's house, most of those events actually happened in the territory of the Jezreel Valley. So then, if you think about how Israel actually played the harlot, and think about everything, if you've been studying the kings and prophets, think about everything we've learned so far. They sinned against God from the very, very beginning of the division of the kingdom. They started with idolatry. They worshiped other gods. They walked in the customs of the nations. They built these idolatrous high places. They completely rejected God's covenants and God's statutes. One king even sacrificed his children by fire, burned them alive to the god Molech. They broke God's commandments. And because of that, God brought judgment to them. He broke Israel's bow about 200 years after the kingdom divided, which was in 931 BC. And Assyria began their besiegement in 732 and then ultimately took Samaria in 722. BC. So for 200 years, God was very patient. God sent prophets and God pled and begged his people to come back to him, and they just wouldn't. Now, the Valley of Jezreel is like this huge open plain in Israel, and it's actually still there today, and it's still called the Valley of Jezreel. Now, in Scripture, it has two other names. It's called the Plain of Esdraelon, and it's also called the Valley of Megiddo. Now, there are mountains kind of along the side, and the Hebrew word for mountain is Har Megiddo, which is where the translation in Revelation becomes Armageddon. Now, in this battle of Armageddon, that really wasn't much of a battle, God will sow again, but this time it won't be for judgment, not a judgment for Israel. But this time it will be an eternal blessing. Now in verses 6 through 9, he has another child from his adulterous wife and a daughter. Now they name his daughter Loruama. Now Loruama means no compassion. Lo, L-O in Hebrew means no or not. So there would be no compassion. And compassion is racham. It means to love very deeply, to have mercy, to have this tender affection for someone or for something. So God's not going to have compassion and mercy on Israel anymore. But ironically, it says that he will have compassion on Judah, on the southern kingdom. But why? What's the difference between them? It's not like Judah constantly followed God either. It was because of covenant, the Davidic covenant that God said there will always be a king of your lineage, David, on the throne forever. So then the next child was a son, and they named him Lo-Ami, which means not my people. These are really odd names that these poor kids are going to be stuck with for the rest of their lives. No compassion and not my people. Because God was proclaiming that Israel would no longer be his people, and he was no longer going to be their God. Now originally, starting in chapter 1, verse 10, in the original language was actually part of chapter 2 because we go through this whole big contrast. But here in most Bibles, it's chapter 1, verse 10. So there's this big contrast because he was talking about their sin, the nation's sin, the consequence of their sin. But now God's going to do that third step in the prophecy pattern, the prophetic pattern, and talk about their future. And in the future, God says that he's going to multiply his people beyond number, just as God promised Abraham in the Abrahamic covenant that there would have as many descendants as the stars in the sky, the sands on the sea, which means they would be innumerable. God's going to do that again. And they're going to be called his sons in the Valley of Jezreel, in the valley where God sows. We worship God who's in the restoration business. God's plan always is for restoration. And then in chapter 2, verse 1, God calls Israel, Ami, my people, on whom he will have ruama, mercy or compassion on them. Now let's continue in chapter 2. Verse 2 of chapter 2 begins with this word contend. Now that word contend actually means to find fault with someone. So he's saying, find fault with your mother. Find fault with your mother. And if you want to cross-reference for that, it's actually chapter 4, verse 4, which we're going to talk about next time. Now the repeated phrase in these verses is harlotry, harlot or harlotry. And the harlot is Gomer. We finally get his wife's name. But it's also Israel in a larger picture. Now, what we see here is Gomer actually having physical adultery after practicing physical harlotry. But Israel is practicing spiritual idolatry. In chapter 1, verse 2, they're forsaking God, which that word forsaking actually means to ignore. In chapter 2, verse 5, it describes it as acting shamefully or being ashamed. And in chapter 2, verse 13, it says it leads to forgetting God. Now, this picture of Hosea and Gomer and what God is telling Israel through this pictorial prophecy is that, you practice harlotry. Even though she was married, God would make it impossible for Israel to actually reach out to her lovers or to the nations. So Israel would run to Assyria and the other nations for help instead of God. But he's not going to let them have any help. And as a result, Israel would finally come to this realization that it's better with God than with others. It's better to follow after God than to follow after the nations. It's a picture of Israel finally coming back to God, to returning to Teshuvah, but only after God uses the nations to exact his judgment against her. And if we really think about it, we could replace Israel with our own names. Because how many times have we reached out for something else besides God? How many times have we reached out for self-help instead of God? What is your knee-jerk reaction when something happens? Is it to go to God, or is it to start making a list and a plan of everything you need to do and everybody you need to contact to kind of get on your team and kind of back you up in whatever it is you're going to do and kind of get your strategy and get your own army going on? And God says, but you're not going to find help that way. And eventually, you are going to come to the realization that it is better to be with God than it is to go after others, and much better than practicing self-help. Now, in verses 8 through 13, when God is a giver. God gave Israel everything they needed in absolute abundance. But he said, I've had enough and I'm going to take it back, including my land. Just like Job, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. But in Job's case, he ended that with, blessed be the name of the Lord. Israel's really not going to be blessing the Lord when Assyria takes them into captivity. As a matter of fact, Assyria is going to remove them from their land, and God's going to uncover and punish their sin, and absolutely no one will be able to escape him. Not your plans, not your nations, not your family, not your friends, not even your church. Continue to play the harlot with God. Continue to run after other things, and absolutely nothing is going to save you from his judgment. Israel used everything that God gave them for idol worship. What does that look like to us? That looks like when God blesses us with abundance and we begin to take credit for it. Or we begin to use that abundance to indulge ourselves with material possessions or selfishness, greed. That's what that looks like in our own lives. Everything listed in verses 8 through 13 happened when Assyria took them into captivity. They were exposed. There was no more gaiety, no more happiness, no more festivals. All there was judgment. Now, I want to point something out in verse 13. That word earrings, when it says she adorned herself with earrings, that literally is nose rings, not in your ear like we think of earrings. It's a bad translation. It literally means nose ring. And that nose ring is going to be very, very significant in just about 1 minute. Now, in verses 14 through 23, this is actually step 3 in the prophetic pattern in chapter 2, because it speaks of their future and there's hope in their future. because God said he's going to cause them to forget or to not remember their idols anymore. And God's going to make a covenant with the animals and with the land, because the land is now going to be fit for habitation, because now God is going to sow it for blessing. There's not going to be any more war. There's going to be this eternal peace, but it hasn't happened yet. And it's not going to happen until the end times. And then there's a beautiful exchange of identity in these verses. And exchanging of identities is covenant language. It says, you're not going to call me Bali anymore, which means my master, my owner, my possessor. But you're going to start calling me Ishi, which means my husband. So you're going to exchange this possessor, this master, for my husband. Now, if I'm under someone who is a master, then I am a slave. And where would my ring be if I'm a slave? Not in my ear, but in my nose. And that's why it's so significant that verse 13 read from the original language, nose rings. They were literally adorning themselves with signs of their slavery to their master, their Bali. Now in verses 19 and 20, it lists 5 ways that God's going to betroth Israel, and actually us also, to himself forever. We are incapable as human beings to betroth ourselves to God. We can't do it. We're not good enough. God, however, in his mercy, in his chesed, he betroths us to him for all eternity. And the first one is in righteousness, tzedek. That means doing what's right, doing what's just. The next one is in justice, mishpat. That's whatever is proper and fitting to do. The third one is his chesed, his loving kindness, his mercy. Then in compassion. And the last is in faithfulness, his emunah, his fidelity. Fidelity, the opposite of harlotry, fidelity, and his steadfastness. Now, in that day is when Israel returns to God. When Israel returns to God, God says, I will respond. I will anah. I will answer. I will speak. I will testify. And God's going to testify first to the heavens. And then the heavens are going to respond to the earth. Probably, I'm thinking with rain, because we're going to sow blessing. God's sowing blessings now. And then the earth is going to respond with grain and wine and oil, with God's provision. And then they are going to respond to Jezreel, because he's sowing, God is sowing his people back in the land for blessing. Look at verse 23 of chapter 2. It says, I will sow for her myself in the land. I will also have compassion on her who had not obtained compassion. And I will say to those who are not my people, you are my people. And they will say, you are my God. Now go back to verse 10. Now in verse 10, it only says that they who were not called his people, or were called not his people, will now be his people. Here it adds that they are going to respond, you are my God. This is only one of 2 places that I've seen in Scripture where it's in the present tense. Is their God. They are my people. I am their God. And not future tense. They will be my people and I will be their God. The second place, besides chapter 2, verse 23 of Hosea, is at the end, the very last verse, I do believe, of Zechariah. Now in Romans 9, 25 and 26, Paul actually quotes Hosea 23. And this is what it says, I will call those who were not my people, and her who was not beloved, beloved. And it shall be in that place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called the sons of the living God. But obviously, Paul is not talking about just Israel. Paul is talking about the Gentiles, the gospel going to the Gentiles. And those Gentiles who are called not my people are then, through the gospel and the acceptance of Jesus Christ as Mashiach, now will be called my people. And those who were not beloved, those whom I had no compassion for, are now going to have compassion because they are going to be called the sons of the living God, because we are grafted in through our belief of the gospel of Jesus. Now, let's move down to chapter 3. God told Hosea, you need to go love Gomer again. You need to go love her again. Even though she's now had these 3 children through her idolatry, you need to go get her back. And you need to love her. So Hosea actually had to go and buy back his idolatrous wife. Now, what is this picture with relation to Israel? God still loved them. And God was going to forgive them. God was not going to abstain from his punishment of them or their discipline, but he did love them and he would forgive them. What is this picture for us? In our harlotry, in our adultery against God, God brought us back through the sacrifice of his son. His son paid the ultimate price to get us back. In the book of Ezekiel, God says, it's not my plan for anyone to perish, but for everyone to teshuvah, to return to me and live. Because what's the basis of Hosea's restoration? It's love. God tells Hosea, go love Gomer again. And what's the basis for our restoration? It's love. And what's the sign of the renewed covenant through Yeshua? It's love. And even when Hosea bought Gomer, they remained separate for a long time. And this is a picture, if you go back to Hosea chapter 1, verse 11, God said they're going to have no leader, no Ra'osh, no head, no chief. And in these verses, he says, there hasn't been a king in the lineage of David since Babylon took them captive in the southern kingdom. And as a nation, they still haven't started to seek God or humble themselves before God. So they're not going to have a king until they choose to have one king. And that's when everything, the land, the people, the world gets a hard reset. And we are back to a theocracy, but this time an eternal theocracy. You know, if we're really, really honest with ourselves, we've all committed spiritual adultery against God. I mean, we've all sinned and fallen short of his glory. But in his infinite chesed, in his infinite mercy and loving kindness, God desired for no one to perish, but he desires for us to repent so that he can then reconcile us back and restore our lives. Now, if you're studying with us and you don't have a book, you can actually prepare for next week by studying Hosea chapters 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It sounds like a lot, but we're going to explore the topic, my people perish for lack of knowledge. And we don't want to perish for lack of knowledge. So I hope to see you back here again next time. And until then, Shavua Tov. Have a great week, everyone. Shalom, shalom.